I was going to say.
Volleyball game?
Yes.
I think I've seen you.
We sit on the floor in the front row.
Yes, yeah. My kids have just discovered how fun it is, so we've gone to the.
Yeah, so for the next one, and then you can just come sit with us.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I'll send you an email.
I don't know, how many kids do you have? How many of you go?
There's 5 of us that usually go.
Depends, because we have, there's 2 of us, plus my kid often goes.
Oh, okay.
And we have our neighbors who always go with us. They've been on safari in Africa for a couple of weeks, so they're not always there. But
well, if it doesn't
we
work
can,
out,
no,
that's
we
fine
can,
anyway,
we can continue.
Yeah.
I will send you the schedule and you go, this is the one we're going to. I recognize when you have kids, you never know. Are they volleyball players?
No, neither of them are. They're still 9 and 6, so they're not.
They'll become volleyball players.
My daughter, it would be good for her. Yeah. We've been trying to find a sport that she.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of great skills and it's like the.
Yes, I'm going to go.
I know, it's way tighter than it should be.
Yes, good. And how are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Okay.
I'm also enjoying my
nice,
time.
isn't it?
Very nice.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Okay. I want you to introduce you. They're here every. Yeah, no doubt. Here.
Out of classroom.
Kind of, they're, got the deer in the headlights, it's like, yeah, okay, and we're doing WOTUS on Monday, so it's sort of like,
That's really what it is.
so yeah, I was like, okay, so here's where we are with the ACE.
Well, in the midst of all that, thanks for making time to come out.
Hey!
Let me welcome everyone to the Wallace Stegner Center's 15th Annual Young Scholar Lecture. I'm Bob Kiter. I direct the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment here at the S.J.D Quinney College of Law. It's truly our pleasure to have you with us today to participate in this program that it amazes me now covers 15 years with the presentation that we'll have today. Before getting into that, a few preliminary announcements. Tomorrow, our speaker will be presenting a CLE program downtown at the Holland and Hart law firm on downstream of Montana versus Wyoming, equity, tribes, and the Yellowstone River Compact. If this is of interest, then it's possible to register on the Stegner Center website. Registration is required for this program. I should also note in terms of upcoming activities, spring semester this year promises to be quite active for the Stegner Center. We've got a robust lineup of programs that include a presentation by the still relatively new Executive Director of the Department of Natural Resources, Brian S.J.D, who also is a graduate of this law school. We'll also have a presentation by photographer and oceanographer Chris Linder on the Big Thaw, Ancient Carbon, Modern Science, and a Race to Save the World. The details of these events are available on the Stegner Center website, along with the information about other programs this spring semester. On March 19th and 20th, we will host the Stegner Center's 25th Annual Symposium. The topic this year, Food and the Environment, Resilient and Equitable Food Security for the West. Registration is required for the event, and the program should be up on the website right after the first of the year. The usual announcement, please turn off the ringers on cell phones. We're delighted to welcome as our young scholar today, Professor Jason Robison from the University of Wyoming College of Law. A bit about the Stegner Center Young Scholar Program. This was founded in 2003 with the goal of recognizing and establishing a relationship with promising scholars early in their academic careers. The recipients of the Young Scholar designation and selection are based on their accomplishments, the quality of their academic work, and their promise in the field of natural resources and environmental law and policy. Over the past 15 years, the Stegner Center has been honored to host an elite group of young scholars. In reflecting on our 15th anniversary, I was gratified to consider the many accomplishments that this group of individuals have achieved throughout their careers, both before but most notably after we honored them with this designation. The screen behind me has been reflecting who our past young scholars are, and we also included a brochure flyer right outside the door if you are interested, including information about both the scholars and the Young Scholars program. They are an accomplished group that are represented in law schools currently throughout the country. Let me also particularly thank the founding donor for this program, the Young Scholar Program, which has been with us from the beginning. That's the Cultural Vision Fund that provides support not only for the Young Scholar Program, but also for a number of other Stegner Center programs, including the symposium, our conferences, and our lecture series. I think it's appropriate, and I would ask you to join me in recognizing the Cultural Vision Fund. So today we'll hear from Professor Jason Robison on the topic of Beyond Bears Ears, Postcolonialism, and Grand Canyon National Park. Professor Robison is a faculty member in the Environmental, Energy, and Natural Resources Law program at the University of Wyoming College of Law. He's been there since 2013. We can congratulate him for achieving full tenure this year as a law professor. Congratulations, Jason. Jason earned his S.J.D. and LL.M. degree in law from Harvard Law School. He also holds a Juris Doctorate degree from the University of Oregon School of Law, and his undergraduate degree, a Bachelor of Science, is in Environmental Studies from our own institution, the University of Utah. We're happy to welcome you home also today. Prior to becoming a law professor, he held a number of legal and policy positions with several organizations, including the Harvard Water Security Initiative, Harvard Law School's Emmett Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, the Oregon Supreme Court, the Oregon Department of Justice's Special Litigation Unit, and the list goes on there. It's also notable that Professor Robison loves the American West. His research revolves around subjects that distinguish this region, including American Indian law, public lands law, and water law. He's the lead editor on a forthcoming volume focusing on the past, present, and future of Native Americans, public lands, and water in the Colorado River Basin, based upon the historic 1869 Powell expedition, and the past this year being the sesquicentennial of that event. The volume is entitled Vision and Place, John Wesley Powell and Reimagining the Colorado River Basin. As a contributing author in the book, I can tell you that Jason has labored mightily to pull together just an outstanding group of individuals and chapters that address these interrelated topics tying into the Colorado River Basin. He teaches Indian law, federal courts, international environmental law, and water law and policy. He also, and this is timely for today's lecture, serves on the University of Wyoming President's Native American Affairs Advisory Council, and for that service has received the Chief Washke Foundation's Distinguished Leadership Award for chairing the subcommittee that drafted the university's first ever Native American and Indigenous Affairs Strategic Plan. He's also part of the leadership team for the Water and Tribes Initiative in the Colorado River Basin. He's a busy young professor, and we're very pleased to have him as the Stegner Center's 15th Annual Young Scholar. Please join me in welcoming Jason Robison.
Well, with an introduction like that, I hope I don't disappoint you. Thanks for taking time to come out this afternoon and hear my remarks. I want to begin by thanking generally family and friends in the audience who took time to be here. My mom and dad are here. That's really special. Yeah. So I suppose if they weren't here, I wouldn't be, right? In the big picture, yeah. My partner, photographer Rainey Robison, she also came out, and our three little ones, Lena, Alice, and Lars, those little rascals here in the back. I wanted them to be here for this presentation, and I hope that connection becomes clear as I proceed through my remarks. More on the professional front, I couldn't say enough glowing things about the Stegner Center and the Stegner Center faculty. Bob Kiter, Bob Adler, Robin Craig, John Ruppel, you're all here today. Really appreciate it. It's been amazing to develop those relationships over the years. And lest I forget, the gentleman who headed the environmental studies program when I was doing undergrad at the University of Utah, political scientist Dan McCool, also made time to come out. So really appreciate it. I know you're busy people, and I'm flattered that my stuff is important enough for you to come out. Really appreciate it. All right, in addition to these thanks, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we're gathering this afternoon is traditional homeland of several Native American tribes, including the Ute and the Shoshone. I'm here to talk about the place depicted here in Edward Curtis's famous photograph, Home of the Havasupai, and that is, of course, Grand Canyon. More precisely, true to its title, the photo's title that is, I'm here today to offer food for thought about Grand Canyon National Park's future co-management by the National Park Service and Native American tribes with traditional connections to the canyon, including its guardians, the Havasupai tribe. I want to be clear at the outset of my remarks, I speak only for myself, not for any of the tribal sovereigns. These are purely my remarks as a citizen and resident of the American West. The ideas presented grow out of a relationship that I've had the blessing of holding nearly my entire life with the Colorado Plateau, including Grand Canyon. 2019 has been a monumental year for the Colorado Plateau. On one hand, as Bob alluded to, it marks a sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of John Wesley Powell's epic 1869 expedition down the Green and Colorado rivers. Native peoples of the Colorado Plateau no doubt had gained inestimable knowledge about the landscape, waterscape, etc. of the Colorado River system for millennia prior to John Wesley Powell's adventure. And there were also Euro-Americans, both Spaniards and Americans, who had also traversed certain portions of the river system. But to Powell's credit, his was the first scientific expedition down the Green and Colorado rivers. And his ascription of the name Grand Canyon during this journey to the place ended up sticking. That's why it's referred to as it is today. So this milestone called for a sesquicentennial Colorado River expedition, or SCREE, to retrace Powell's nearly 1,000 river mile journey 150 years later. My colleague at the University of Wyoming, geographer Tom Minkley, organized this expedition this past summer. Not for the sake of just running the river, as amazing as that is though, and so fun and so exciting, but fundamentally to promote dialogue among trip participants and communities along the river's corridor about John Wesley Powell and the Colorado River Basin from past, present, and future perspectives. What was John Wesley Powell's vision for the Colorado River Basin? To what extent has that vision shaped the Colorado River Basin as a place in modern times? And what would we, as a society, like to see the basin become as a place in the future? These questions drive the sesquicentennial volume that Bob Kiter alluded to. It's a volume for which I'm serving as lead editor as part of the overarching SCREE project. Vision in place, John Wesley Powell, and reimagining the Colorado River Basin. A crew of 16 authors, 8 visual artists, and 2 cartographers contributed to the volume, including Bob Adler, Bob Kiter, and Dan McCool in the audience today. As Bob mentioned, Bob Kiter that is, the volume will be published by University of California Press next year. Yet, SCREE only gets us half the way there. 2019 was also a monumental year for the Colorado Plateau because of Grand Canyon National Park's centennial. It too has provided a special occasion for reflection, including for the editors of the Journal of Arizona History. They brought together, similar to the SCREE project, a diverse crew of scholars, activists, river rats, or some combination thereof, to devote a centennial issue to Grand Canyon National Park. I had the opportunity to contribute one of the essays, Grand Canyon as Legal Creation, and it essentially brought me here to Salt Lake today. Metaphorically, I found myself at a confluence with these two projects and historical milestones. The most exciting thing about Vision in Place for me has been to think about the Colorado River Basin's future through the lens of John Wesley Powell's ideas. On the other hand, the most exciting thing for me about the Grand Canyon Centennial essay has been to learn about the Native peoples so interconnected, so deeply connected with the place that is the canyon. So this project that I'm about to unfold over the next 45 minutes or so really did originate at a confluence of these two things I've been working on and the two historical milestones in Western history associated with them. Again, I'm so grateful to the Stegner Center for the invitation to bring all this work together into one place. Here's where I'm going to go over roughly the next 45 minutes. I'll try to keep it 40 if I can. I'm going to begin by discussing tribal connections to Grand Canyon as a native space. Then I'll talk about the colonization of Grand Canyon and its indigenous peoples. And finally, I'll cast an eye toward Grand Canyon National Park's bicentennial, from the centennial to the bicentennial, and rely on Bears Ears to propose future federal tribal co-management at Grand Canyon. So, let's start here. John Wesley Powell didn't discover Grand Canyon. Shocker, right? The human beings with the deepest connections to this place, the most intimate knowledge of it, are the Native American communities who have shaped their lives in and around the canyon for millennia, who have raised their children, who have buried their dead, who have rooted their cultures, identities, values, and spiritual traditions in this place. Grand Canyon is, and always will be, native space. The precise amount of time that human beings have been present in the canyon, either as inhabitants or as seasonal residents, seasonal visitors, varies based upon whom you talk to. Tribes like the Havasupai, the Hualapai, the Hopi, the Zuni consider themselves to have always been in the canyon. They originated within it. Western scientists continue to conduct research on this subject, but according to one estimate from Arizona State University and the Grand Canyon Conservancy, quote, archaeologists have found evidence of human use of the Grand Canyon dating back at least 13,000 years to the last ice age. That is millennia, many millennia, prior to those civilizations often most closely associated with ancient history in mainstream U.S. society. Ancient Rome, Greece, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and others. So, in the scale of human history, we're talking about deep time, a span of human history broken up by Western scientists into periods focusing on Paleo-Indians, also referred to as the Clovis people, the Archaic period, basket makers, and ancestral Puebloans, depicted here from the North Rim. For sake of brevity, this map from the Grand Canyon Trust cuts from the prehistorical to the historical period and identifies Native peoples with traditional connections to Grand Canyon right now. More specifically, the map identifies, on one hand, areas in Grand Canyon of cultural significance to the tribes, thank you Grand Canyon Trust, and on the other hand, reservations in and around Grand Canyon where the tribes were often, though not always, relocated to acculturate and assimilate into mainstream U.S. society. There are a total of 11 Grand Canyon tribes according to the National Park Service. The Havasupai, Hualapai, Hopi, Navajo, Zuni, Yavapai Apache, and 5 Paiute bands pictured on this map. Again, these tribes have deep connections to Grand Canyon, deeper than I'm able to articulate, and frankly, it wouldn't be my place to do so. But they exist. And thanks to the work of a Dene, that is a Navajo woman by the name of Serrana Riggs, and others, tribal members have been expressing firsthand this centennial year what Grand Canyon means to them as part of the Grand Canyon Trust's Intertribal Centennial Conversations Group. Here's an initial perspective from a Hopi tribal member. The canyon is a very sacred place. It's awe without words. For the Hopi, it's a very spiritual place because of the Sipapuni, where we emerge from into this world. And it's where we go back to when we leave this world. I've felt an energy down there that is unreal. They say our ancestors dwell in the canyon, and I definitely believe that. A similar perspective, emphasizing origin and identity directly from a Navajo elder. The canyon is a sacred place. You only go there with prayers in your heart, with purpose on your mind, with purpose in your steps. Then you leave it the way you found it. You don't look back. You don't wander there. All those places are protection spaces for us. That's where life began. It's where I get my cultural identity. And a complementary perspective, the final, from a Havasupai tribal member. The Grand Canyon from the Havasupai perspective is the embryotic, the emergence, the origin of how we came to be. We try to take care of it. We've always wanted to take care of it, and we still feel like we do take care of it. Living at the bottom of the canyon, I feel like I hear the heartbeat of Mother Earth a lot closer than I would on higher ground. So it would seem to me that the Havasupai, in their blood and with every breath, know how to take care of the Grand Canyon. There's a lot packed into those remarks. But at least two things I would suggest are clear. First, when it comes to American Indians, time, and the law, the 100 years during which Grand Canyon National Park has been in existence is a blip. Grand Canyon is native space. Second, I know firsthand from tribal members' comments not captured in these quotes that what the past century for them has been like in Grand Canyon throws into question whether the national park's centennial is a reason for celebration or something far different. And that requires an honest discussion about colonization. The United States is a settler state. Like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, with and sometimes without the sanction of law, Euro-American peoples colonized the portion of North America within the United States for approximately 350 years prior to Grand Canyon National Park's founding in 1919. This colonization involved both physical and cultural genocide for Native peoples. This is heavy baggage for mainstream U.S. society. Skeletons in the closet, more commonly the subject of ignorance or perhaps denial, then honest acceptance, and most importantly, atonement. Grand Canyon is one of many places where the colonization process can be seen, and it must be brought to light in order to chart the canyon's future. My use of the term indigenous peoples within this presentation to describe Grand Canyon's tribal communities is rooted in this commonly recognized working definition from international law. Based on this definition, my intent is to convey the idea that Grand Canyon is, in modern times, a place that indeed has been subject to Euro-American colonization, but that nonetheless contains Native communities who possess deep historical connections to the canyon as part of their traditional homelands and wish to maintain and to transmit to future generations those connections and other aspects of their identities as part of the process of self-determination. This definition, however, begs the question of exactly what colonization has entailed. As a matter of U.S. law, here's a starting point. The federal government's presence in Grand Canyon traces primarily to this 1848 treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War. Through this treaty, the United States assumed sovereignty over and ownership of the vast majority of lands within the Colorado River Basin. This map geographically identifies the precise territory encompassed by the treaty, which of course includes Grand Canyon. You might think of the treaty as opening a gateway or a portal to this landscape. And through that gateway, through this treaty, the U.S. Constitution came to apply to this space. Three constitutional provisions are particularly notable. One provision is implicit from the treaty itself, the federal government's treaty power. It's been used to form treaties with Indian nations, just as it has with European powers. The property clause is the second provision I would flag. Land and resources covered by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had become, quote, property of the United States to be governed and disposed of from that point forward by Congress. And lastly, Congress was also vested with the power to regulate commerce among Indian tribes, with Indian tribes more precisely, the Indian Commerce Clause, which could be interpreted in a broad manner. Not only did the Constitution come to adhere to Grand Canyon through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but also a trio of seminal cases from the U.S. Supreme Court, collectively called the Marshall Trilogy, after Chief Justice John Marshall. They brought the European doctrine of discovery into U.S. law, now applicable on the Colorado Plateau, relegating Native peoples' property rights to their homelands in Grand Canyon to a, quote, right of occupancy that could be extinguished by the title-bearing imperial power. These cases also informed Native American tribes of their qualified status as sovereigns under U.S. law, specifically their status as, quote, domestic dependent nations. In these ways and others, the colonial system was superimposed on the Grand Canyon region upon the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo's entry into force. And these laws found unmistakable expression on the canyon's landscape. This map again depicts the traditional homelands of the 11 Grand Canyon tribes. One major priority of the colonial system was to open these lands to Euro-American settlement and economic development by forcibly confining tribes to reservations created by federal law. The 1868 treaty with the Navajo was the first instrument to do this job, and it was followed by reservation-creating executive orders up to the early 20th century. 1917 is the last one that I'm aware of. Perhaps most remarkable in this realm is the Havasupai tribe's reservation. Despite the large scope of the Havasupai's traditional homeland, pictured here, President Chester Arthur in 1882 restricted the Havasupai tribe to a 518 acre postage stamp reservation in Havasu Canyon. The Havasupai were relegated to this 518 acre reservation for about a century, until 1975, the passage of the Grand Canyon National Park Enlargement Act, which thankfully expanded the reservation to roughly 188,000 acres. This contemporary map identifies the Havasupai and other Native American reservations in the Grand Canyon region and throughout the broader Colorado River Basin. It accounts for enormous modifications to the reservation boundaries since their creation, particularly the Navajo Nation, actually, but nonetheless conveys the takeaway of this portion of my remarks. The creation of reservations and the confinement of Grand Canyon tribes to reservations understandably directly impacted their connections to their native homelands and the site of their ritual pilgrimages, that is Grand Canyon. Inextricably linked with these actions as a matter of law was the U.S. military. Actions by the U.S. military against Grand Canyon tribes. The most well-known of these actions is the Navajo Long Walk, involving the U.S. military's forced removal of more than 8,000 Navajo tribal members from traditional lands in the Grand Canyon region in 1864 to the Bosque Redondo internment camp 300 miles away in eastern New Mexico. After 4 years of internment at this desolate camp and approximately 200 Navajo killed as a result of exposure and starvation during the long walk, the Navajo, go figure, signed the 1868 treaty creating their reservation. And notably, the Navajo were not alone in this respect. The Hualapai tribe endured similar forced relocation and internment, something the tribe calls the La Paz Trail of Tears, during the mid-1870s after violent confrontations with the U.S. military during the 1860s. Now, all of these events, and I know they're heavy, they came to pass prior to the time at which Grand Canyon National Park was established, and that was 1919. The national park's backstory as a matter of public lands law involves more milestones than I am able to convey given the time I'm allotted. But suffice it to say that the idea of a national park at Grand Canyon can be traced to proposals by then Senator Benjamin Harrison, introduced in the 1880s, and that the national park was preceded by Grand Canyon National Monuments designation by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1908. More important as a goal in my research has been to gain a sense of what interactions have been like between the federal agencies responsible for administering Grand Canyon National Park, initially the U.S. Forest Service, but primarily, nowadays, the National Park Service and Grand Canyon tribes. To put this subject into context, some excellent work has been done on relations between the National Park Service and tribes for a number of parks. For example, Glacier, Yosemite, and closer to where I'm at in Laramie, Yellowstone. This work highlights commonalities such as, number one, how early legislation creating national parks made no mention of Native American inhabitants or any provision for their continued presence. Number two, how early national parks were created without regard for competing Native American claims or concerns. And third, how Native Americans were routinely excluded from and dispossessed of traditional lands with the creation of early national parks. The animosity and frankly arrogance apparent in these commonalities applies to much, though not all, of Grand Canyon's history, which was described by one of my interviewees as involving a relationship of, quote, exclusion, hostility, and antagonism. Some particulars. There was disregard of Grand Canyon's tribe's prior rights and occupation in conjunction with the national park's designation. There was a Euro-American overwrite of place names in Grand Canyon, as described by one piece of work from the 1990s, quote, of today's 230 place names, 8 are Havasupai, 13 Paiute, and 4 Hopi, out of 230. More Grand Canyon names originate with Asian and Egyptian mythology than from native words. Change the name of the place. Moving on, there was virtually no coverage of Grand Canyon tribes in early park superintendent reports dated from 1920 to 1932, and general cultural ignorance of tribes among park rangers up to the mid-20th century, the 1950s. There was eviction of Havasupai tribal members from a spot in Grand Canyon called Indian Garden. There were unsuccessful proposals to relocate the Havasupai from their traditional homelands in the heart of the canyon. There were removals and burnings of Havasupai dwellings, that is, homes, by the National Park Service. And there have been recurring conflicts over Supai Camp, a place called Supai Camp on Grand Canyon's North Rim. Again, I'll rely on tribal members' first-hand voices to describe these challenges, beginning with an initial Havasupai perspective. Borders. The Park Service showed up and told us what the borders were. And it was really hard to understand that we couldn't enter Park Service land anymore. The national park's original inability to communicate with the source communities who either lived there or would come there for ritual pilgrimages. So the original partnership lacked and never existed. And then after about 80 years, then they wanted to start creating partnerships. And I appreciate that. I just wish they would acknowledge the years before, to acknowledge that they didn't want us involved, and to say they're sorry. A similar perspective from the Havasupai sister tribe, Hualapai. Since the creation of the national park at Grand Canyon, their whole approach was not very accommodating to the tribes. Theodore Roosevelt went there, designated it, and had all the tribes moved out of that area, claiming it as a national treasure for the American people. We are the American people too, and that's our homeland. That's where we're from. So when we look back on our ties to the canyon, we just can't abandon that and go by somebody's proclamation that moved us out. Finally, here is Serrana Riggs, Navajo tribal member who does work for the Grand Canyon Trust. The centennial anniversary is a mere slice compared to the indigenous history of the Grand Canyon region. For the 11 tribes that call the canyon home, the park's milestone is muddied with mistreatment. The creation of Grand Canyon National Park pushed the canyon's original inhabitants off their ancestral lands and excluded them from stewardship, management, and economic opportunities in the park. But the centennial opens the door to redefine relationships, have tough conversations, and bring new ideas to the table. It's on that note, that upbeat note, that I'll turn to what is the heart of my presentation. And that is the notion of Grand Canyon National Park's centennial, opening the door to, as Serrana Riggs put it, redefining relationships, having tough conversations, and bringing new ideas to the table. I'll set the stage for this forward-looking material with a couple quotes from Bob Kiter's book, To Conserve Unimpaired, The Evolution of the National Park Idea. The first quote comes from the introduction. I'll summarize or I'll paraphrase. Just as there is no singular foreordained understanding of the National Park Service's fundamental mandate in the 1916 Organic Act, and let me be clear about that mandate, it reads, to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. The conserve unimpaired mandate. Just as there is no uniform, inherent interpretation of those words, so too is there no singular foreordained understanding of what this human institution called a national park must be. The concept has been and will continue to be subject to diverse interpretations across time. The second quote from chapter 6 on ancestral lands plugs in right here. There's no doubt that national parks will evolve over the next 100 years in response to climate change, unprecedented visitation, amazing, bewildering needs for interagency coordination, and otherwise. Within this complex milieu, however, I suggest our future thinking about Grand Canyon and other national park units needs to, quote, embrace the notion of parks as native homelands. We need to look soberly at the colonial history of our settler state, our settler nation state, and to move toward postcolonialism at Grand Canyon and other park units. Federal tribal co-management arrangements are instrumental to this. Yet, precisely what is meant by co-management? Figuring out exactly what this concept means, and maybe more importantly, how to actually do it on the ground in the context of federal tribal relations over national parks is cutting-edge work in the field of public lands policy. We can see elements of co-management in circumstances where it's currently being done in one form or another right now. Canyon de Chelly National Monument's one example. The Columbia River Basin salmon fisheries provides another example. There are others domestically and internationally, and I can't open that door in its entirety. But I will say, one intriguing thing for me as a legal scholar is model building. That is trying to conceptualize the component parts of federal tribal co-management on public lands for evaluative purposes. What are the constituent elements of co-management? Can they be organized in a framework that can be used to analyze the extent to which co-management is occurring in park units or, more broadly, on other federal reservations, other areas of the public lands? Now, regardless of how co-management is conceptualized, as a practical matter, there are several efforts going on in and around Grand Canyon now that involve federal tribal cooperation. And I want to recognize these, particularly given the material I've covered about the colonial legacy. The Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program is one effort. It was created by the Grand Canyon Protection Act in 1992 and includes a working group that offers the Secretary of the Interior recommendations about Glen Canyon Dam's operation and associated management actions. 6 tribal groups have formal representatives on this working group, and these tribes have been closely involved in the working group's work, including, as just one example, providing input about Grand Canyon's cultural resources during National Environmental Policy Act processes, addressing Glen Canyon Dam's operation in 1996, when Secretary Babbitt was in that office, and more recently with the adoption of something called the LTEMP, Long-Term Experimental Management Plan for Glen Canyon Dam in 2016. Tribes have been directly involved in providing cultural resources input on those occasions. Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program, to be clear, has been subject to both praise and criticism. My point here is simply to flag one thing. Tribes have a seat at the table. Another domain where we're seeing federal tribal cooperation is in an area of Grand Canyon National Park called Desert View, whose perhaps most recognizable landmark is depicted here, the Hopi Watchtower. Contemporary federal tribal collaboration at Desert View focuses on interpretation, park interpretation. It's being reconceived right now by an intertribal working group as a, quote, living landscape, where Grand Canyon tribal members can provide live cultural demonstrations and serve as interpreters to offer firsthand accounts of tribal connections to and histories of Grand Canyon. Tribal economic development is also a priority. Specifically, the notion of bolstering tourism and recreation revenues in reservation communities located adjacent to the national park. For information about this tribal engagement in the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program and at Desert View, I want to publicly thank a public servant by the name of Jan Balsam, Senior Advisor to the Park Superintendent at Grand Canyon and a longtime tribal liaison. We're grateful for your work, Jan, if you're watching this from a distance. More can and should be done. These two examples of federal tribal cooperation involving Grand Canyon beg the question of how co-management might evolve over the next 100 years. What else might be done to further transcend the colonial legacy? I would suggest one piece of the answer can be found at another sacred landscape northeast of Grand Canyon on the Colorado Plateau, Bears Ears. There is a lot to the Bears Ears story, so my remarks are necessarily selective. Bears Ears is a 1.35 million acre national monument in southeastern Utah, established by President Obama in 2016 by proclamation under the 1906 Antiquities Act. This map depicts the monument's boundaries under President Obama's proclamation. 1 year later, in 2017, President Trump issued a proclamation attempting to reduce the monument's size by about 85%, from approximately 1.35 million acres to 200,000 acres. I question this purported reduction as a matter of both law and policy. It's being litigated in federal court right now, and therefore choose to depict the monument's original boundaries for this presentation. Indigenous peoples drew those boundaries through President Obama's pen. Bears Ears' genesis can be attributed to many groups, but particularly the tireless advocacy of a coalition of 5 tribes called the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, supported by 30 other tribes and numerous other organizations. The coalition submitted the proposal to President Obama in 2015 that ultimately resulted in Bears Ears designation. The proposal called for a 1.9 million acre monument, while 1.35 million acres were actually designated. This tribal effort is so remarkable in the history of U.S. public lands policy. At the same time, it's so unremarkable, entirely understandable, given what's at stake. A native landscape inhabited for at least 12,000 years that is replete with sacred sites, ruins, traditional medicines, and other elements integral to the connected tribes' identities. The tribe's proposal for management of this landscape, Bears Ears, was visionary. It called for true federal tribal collaborative management and full partnership between the tribes and federal agencies, U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, to this end. More specifically, the proposal called for the establishment of 2 entities, a Bears Ears Management Commission and a monument manager. The commission would be the monument's policymaking and planning body, composed of 8 representatives, 1 from each coalition tribe, plus 3 federal officials. In turn, the manager would report to and take direction from the commission, developing the monument's management plan and handling day-to-day operations. In the event joint decision-making by the federal and tribal officials proved impossible on some management issue, the proposal called for the relevant secretary, either the Secretary of Agriculture or the Secretary of the Interior, to break the impasse and to make the ultimate decision. But the secretary would be required to provide a written opinion explaining the rationale for the decision. Now, the management structure later established by President Obama's 2016 proclamation would resemble, but not mirror, the tribe's vision in the proposal, being a bit more federalized in structure. The proclamation called for the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior to manage Bears Ears through the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, respectively, including preparing its management plan. A federal advisory commission was established, consisting of multiple stakeholders, including tribes, to provide advice on the management plan and management activities. And finally, a Bears Ears Commission was created, composed of 1 official from each coalition tribe to offer recommendations on the management plan and management actions. Recommendations from the Bears Ears Commission were to be taken seriously. A written explanation was required from the Secretary of the Interior if the choice was made to deviate from those recommendations. And then came, President Trump's 2017 proclamation. As mentioned already, its legality is being questioned right now in federal court, but it purported to organize the approximately 200,000 acre reduced monument into 2 units, Indian Creek and Shasjaw. In turn, the proclamation purported to rename the Bears Ears Commission, as noted here, to restrict its authority to the Shasjaw unit, and to add a San Juan County Commissioner to the commission. The coalition tribes represented on this commission oppose as illegal the attempted reduction of Bears Ears by President Trump, and thus they have chosen not to participate in the commission's meetings. And the coalition tribes and others have also opposed the Federal Advisory Committee. It set aside 2 seats for tribal representatives, while there are 5 tribes within the coalition, each of which is a sovereign government under U.S. law. That is a major concern. Another controversy that's been heavily reported on in the Salt Lake Tribune and otherwise is that the tribal representatives appointed to the 2 seats actually weren't supporters of the original Bears Ears designation. It's been described as the deck being politically stacked. These issues about Bears Ears management are critical no doubt we could get lost in the weeds. Instead, I want to bring us back to the deep, breathtaking canyon. How should we as a society manage Grand Canyon over the next 100 years? What should federal tribal relations look like as of the national park's bicentennial in 2113? Bears Ears offers much food for thought, in my opinion. Here again is the map depicting the 11 tribes with traditional connections to Grand Canyon. Like Bears Ears, Grand Canyon is plainly native space. The progress in federal tribal relations over the past 30 years, roughly, at Grand Canyon is a good thing. Federal engagement with Grand Canyon tribes over the Colorado River's management and native histories and interpretations are surely positives. When looking toward Grand Canyon National Park's bicentennial, however, what else can be done? How else can tribes work with the Park Service as co-managers of this native space? I find inspiration here in the formation of the Intertribal Working Group to reconceive of Desert View as a native space, and in the formation of the Intertribal Centennial Conversations Group to spark the very dialogue about Grand Canyon's future that's ultimately at the heart of my presentation. One particular idea being discussed within the latter group, the Intertribal Centennial Conversations Group, needs to be highlighted, and that is the potential creation of a, quote, Grand Canyon Stewardship Council. It would directly involve tribal communities through cooperative agreements and partnerships to better manage and interpret public lands adjoining tribal lands. For me, this idea is a seed. What I personally would like to see it grow into over the next 100 years at Grand Canyon is something like the Intertribal Coalition's proposal for Bears Ears, a Grand Canyon Management Commission. Two features of this commission are worth outlining again. First, the notion of land management planning occurring at Grand Canyon within a body composed of National Park Service and perhaps other federal officials alongside representatives from each Grand Canyon tribe. That would be real, integrated partnership and collaborative management. Second, the notion that if these parties were to reach an impasse in their decision-making on the Grand Canyon Management Commission, for some particular aspect of the National Parks management, the Secretary of the Interior would break the impasse and be obligated to offer a written explanation for the particular decision made. As explained in the coalition's proposal for Bears Ears, the reason for this latter feature, Secretary as tiebreaker, is something called the unlawful delegation doctrine addressed in a federal district court case by the name of Stanton. The key holding in this case is excerpted in the text, but the general idea is the National Park Service cannot delegate to another entity management responsibilities for a park unit without maintaining some supervisory authority over that entity and without taking stock of the nature of that entity's interests, the stakeholder interests within that entity, as compared to the Park Service statutory conserve unimpaired mandate. You can't have those things or it will violate the unlawful delegation doctrine. Now, although a Grand Canyon Management Commission is what I truly would like to see when the National Park's bicentennial rolls around in 2119, I recognize that some may find the idea challenging, even given the 100-year timescale. Change within the colonial system is intergenerational and involves something tricky, relinquishing control. Funding arrangements would need to be solidified to enable tribal representation, and in some cases, capacity building, particularly technical capacity building, also might need to occur. For these reasons, perhaps a gradual intergenerational path might be preferable as an alternative. Specifically, relying on the management structure set forth in President Obama's Bears Ears proclamation, creating an intermediate entity called the Grand Canyon Commission. It would be more federalized in structure, as is the case with Bears Ears, calling for the Secretary of the Interior to continue managing Grand Canyon through the National Park Service, but establishing the commission composed of one representative from each Grand Canyon tribe to offer recommendations to the Secretary on land management decisions, and requiring the Secretary to provide written explanations when making decisions that deviated from the Commission's recommendations. The unlawful delegation doctrine would not pose a single problem for such an intermediate entity. And perhaps the entity would prove useful in ironing out long-term funding arrangements for tribal representation on the Commission, as well as for facilitating capacity building within the member tribes. And that brings together everything I've been discussing as food for thought. The Intertribal Working Group and the Intertribal Centennial Conversations Group are doing important work right now reclaiming Grand Canyon as native space, pushing back against, moving forward from the colonial legacy. This reclaiming has multiple parts, but it seems tribal engagement in land management necessarily must be one. The Intertribal Centennial Conversations Group's Grand Canyon Stewardship Council proposal speaks to this point, the inherent need to address tribal land management as an overall piece of reclaiming Grand Canyon as native space. As an ally to this effort, I believe the formation of a federal tribal co-management body for Grand Canyon National Park is a fitting, natural piece of this progression. I believe it deserves thought, patient, methodical reflection by the tribal members and others currently involved in the work of the Intertribal Working Group and the Intertribal Centennial Conversations Group. And in this spirit, I would suggest the two commission models envisioned for Bears Ears, the coalition's Bears Ears Management Commission, President Obama's Bears Ears Commission, are path-breaking reference points for Grand Canyon. They speak to the question of how to do it, how to possibly design a federal tribal co-management structure for Grand Canyon National Park. They do not speak to the question of whether to do it. For me, that latter question feels rhetorical. Grand Canyon's deep history and nature as native space needs to be recognized. The colonial legacy that has clouded that history and nature needs to be called out. And ultimately, we as a society need to strive for things to look considerably different 100 years from now at the national park's bicentennial in terms of native vision shaping this place. Again, thanks for taking time to listen to my spiel this afternoon. I'd love to have dialogue about the ideas, any aspect of them. Please.
I know right now the Cherokee Nation is engaged with the federal government because we were in a treaty, it was stipulated we would have a representative to Congress, and right now we have one selected and they're trying to get that actually to come into fruition. Do any other tribes have an agreement like that with the government, and if so, are any of them pursuing it like that?
Not to my knowledge. The most robust tribe in the United States, both in terms of population and the size of its reservation, is the Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation's reservation is roughly equivalent to the size of West Virginia, the state of West Virginia. But no, in my research, I haven't come across anything regarding the Grand Canyon tribes seeking formal representation within the legislative branch of our government. Thanks for the question. Others. I don't know the protocol here at the Stegner Center events, but it looks like you got mics down here. I think they're recording it, and that's the reason that they're hoping to get people's questions on the record. I appreciate it. This question's going to be hard, I promise you that.
Yeah, I take a shot and yell to do it.
What?
We're ambulating over there. There's a lot of mining that have prevailed for quite a long time, but are continuing to be promoted. And I can't quite
Indeed.
see how this arrangement, as you've hoped for it, I guess you might say, would address the authority of the Secretary or the Department of Interior in general to approve that kind of mining activity that so thoroughly could dominate the park and the areas of tribal interest.
Two peas in a pod. It might never have to. If Representative Grijalva's Grand Canyon Centennial Protection Act gets enacted in Congress, right? Both chambers, and I'm not saying that the odds are good, but if it does, the uranium mining ban temporarily put into place under the Obama administration would become permanent, and I hope it does. If that happens, that aspect of mining activity at Grand Canyon would no longer need to be, I would say, within the province or the work product of the commission. Let's say it doesn't, though. I do believe that the commission could be involved in formulating policy proposals to address future mining prohibitions in and adjacent to the national park. And furthermore, even if they didn't, I think you'd have other entities. Again, Grand Canyon Trust is an excellent example. Roger Clark is the one there who is the director of their Grand Canyon program. He's been pushing the uranium ban work quite intensely. I don't think that's going to go by the wayside, irrespective of the fate of Grijalva's legislation, although again, I hope it passes. Thanks for the question. Dan McCool.
Jason, what do you think of the idea of tribes creating their own national parks and labeling them as such?
So that idea is not without precedent. A lot of my research in this area has focused on the way tribes have assumed a leadership role in places in the United States outside of the Colorado River Basin. I believe there's a proposal for a Badlands National Park that would have been tribal in nature. I don't know the status of that. When it comes to Grand Canyon, though, because of the visitation rate, the technical capacity needed, it's a World Heritage Site, it's so international in nature, as well as being native space, I think the arrangement would have to be collaborative. I would be leery, as much as I care deeply for and admire my tribal friends and colleagues in Grand Canyon tribes. I'd be concerned about the capacity of the tribes to pull it off at Grand Canyon itself. Elsewhere, perhaps. I mean, that's provoking food for thought. Thanks for stepping up.
Hello, my name is Olivia. Can you please explain what the difference is between efforts towards tribal co-management being post-colonial as opposed to decolonial or anti-colonial, and what the difference is between these words? Yeah.
I don't know that I have a very good answer on that. I can tell you my conception in using the term post-colonialism, and it's a little rough. The U.S. Congress possesses plenary power over Indian affairs. The U.S. Congress can unilaterally break treaties subject only to liability under such constitutional provisions as the Takings Clause. But under the U.S. Supreme Court Precedent Lone Wolf, the U.S. Congress has plenary authority over Native American affairs. From that perspective, the colonial system is sturdy. It's intact. And so when I think about post-colonialism here, I'm thinking about an incremental step where tribal sovereignty is recognized and tribal sovereigns are able to come together with representatives of the federal sovereign and do work that is much different in its collaborative nature than the adversarial relations historically that existed between the federal sovereign and the tribes. So when I say post-colonialism, it's post-colonialism in that sense. Now, I have one colleague who I love and think so much of, Kelsey Leonard. She's from a tribe on Long Island. And in the context of a different project called Indigenous Water Justice, an article published a couple years back in Lewis and Clark Law Journal, if you want to check it out. We got to talking about whether total post-colonialism is possible. Should tribal nations in the 21st century, should their sovereignty be conceived of almost in an international way, from an international framework? Should the self-determination that indigenous peoples engage in be analogous to the self-determination that we see within nation states? I admire that passion and that advocacy. The fire is in the belly there. But we do exist within a constitutional framework that places the federal sovereign as one of enumerated powers at the helm. And because of that, my conception of post-colonialism doesn't involve that international perspective, again, as much as I respect colleagues who want to push things in that direction. Another question.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very thought-provoking, I think. One question, I think, is I wonder what you think about the incrementalism involved in thinking about the next 100 years. And it brings to mind the idea of reparations. And I think Whoopi Goldberg, when they were talking about in Hawaii, the telescope,
yes.
She said, you know, what's the problem? It's indigenous land. Well, the problem is, of course, as you noted at the beginning, it's all indigenous land, even where we are here. And I think it's kind of academic to talk about something that's kind of far away from all of us.
I disagree.
But we have sort of evolved here to where we don't deal hugely day to day with this land and this society.
In the Salt Lake Valley, or where?
And there is some respect, you know, for example, like are we going to have a Ute mascot or that thing? But the question, I guess, is how do you see this sort of relating to that idea of reparations and trying to get a clean slate moving on, and then one person, one vote?
There's a lot there. So, in terms of reparations, I think that's an important aspect of recognizing our colonial history as a nation state and giving true respect to tribal sovereigns, to Native communities as real human beings who were affected in ways, their lives, their livelihoods, their families, that warrant reparations. So that, for me, is very much in keeping with the idea of trying to transcend the colonial legacy. Connecting that to what you were saying, I would distinguish incremental change from transformative change. A place in the West now where that kind of dialogue is going on a lot is surrounding the Colorado River and the law of the river, that is the legal framework that controls allocation and management of water from the Colorado River Basin. Should we make changes to the component parts of the law of the river in a transformative fashion? Should we tinker around the edges and do things incrementally? The answer you get depends on, again, whom you ask. My personal input, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. And I respectfully disagree with what you said about it being academic to think from a long-term time horizon. That might not be culturally embedded in Euro-American culture, but it sure in the hell is embedded in other cultures, including indigenous cultures. I do think it's wise to try to think far in the future and chart a path, notwithstanding Steinbeck's famous quote about best laid plans of mice and men. I get that too. But I think I favor transformative change with incremental implementation. That's the short answer to that question. I'd love to talk more if there are others, unless I'm out of time.
Okay. Let me thank everyone for joining us today for the 15th annual Young Scholar Lecture here at the Wallace Stegner Center. Let me invite you to join us again next semester. We have a whole series of programs that I noted earlier, including the 25th annual symposium. And let's conclude today by recognizing once again Jason and the wonderful talk that he's shared with us.
Thanks. Happy to talk afterwards.